improperly. They didn't understand what they were doing. A starlight scope doesn't measure energy. It only amplifies photons. They were using a radiac meter in an improper way that was used for field measurements and not for point sources. I have actually walked the ground there. I have taken a very specific Geiger counter to measure the area. There's nothing but background radiation.
Let him respond. Chuck?
Well, first of all, have you ever seen a lighthouse move through the forest, Larry? Horizontally, approach you, recede from you, explode into 5 white objects, send down an equivalent of a laser beam, and do so into the weapons storage area? And I would defy anybody to take a police car into the woods. When Jim went out, he took a Jeep and he had to dismount because he couldn't go any further.
Do you think he's lying, James?
No, I think they're just misinterpreting what they saw that night. There were numerous lights out there that night. Let's put it this way. Where would it have been best to have viewed this object that night? It would have been best viewed from the Woodbridge Tower. I interviewed the people that were in the tower that night. They saw nothing. They heard nothing. There was nothing on radar.
The sergeant says it wasn't manned.
It wasn't manned that night. The tower was empty.
The ATC... the tower was manned that night, and the ATC facilities did have control that night. The British radar also saw nothing that night.
Let me get a break, and we'll come back with more. Jim will stay with us. We'll also ask him to talk to Callahan about that Tokyo plane incident. You're watching Larry King Live. Let's check in with Anderson. For a UFO.
Well, I was a district governor of 56 Lions clubs in southwest Georgia, and I had to visit all the Lions clubs and make a speech. And I was outside a school lunchroom one night right before sundown. It was getting dark and we were getting ready to eat supper, and I and about 25 men were standing around, and all of a sudden in the western sky we saw a strange light coming toward us, a round light, and it got closer and closer, and right above the pine trees it stopped. And then it began to change colors from blue to red to white. And then it stayed there for a while. We were all aghast. We didn't know what it was. And then it just disappeared into the west. That was the end of it. So it was a genuine UFO in that it was an unidentified flying object, but I have never thought and still don't think that it's possible for, creatures from Mars to come here and visit us and go back home.
Before we have Jim McGahey respond to the story of that Japanese pilot and what he saw from his Japan air cargo jet, Sergeant Peniston wants to respond to something that James said.
Thank you, Larry. It's just, I respect James for his opinion, but if I was in his position right now, looking at us and looking at this story, I'd probably have a lot of doubt about it too. But this is not about lights in the sky. This is about an object that has landed in a woods and was investigated by a team of experts that are familiar with aircraft identification and that. And there's just no way in the world that this could be anything other than it was a physical craft.
All right, Jim, he's saying he touched the object. He surrounded the object, and the object took off and went into space. That's either a madman.
Well, there's no evidence of that. I've never seen any evidence.
So then you say he's lying.
His report. No, I'm saying he may truly believe that he touched an aircraft.
That also flew.
Something called cofabulation. But the question is there any evidence other than his anecdotal story, his report, that anything occurred? And there isn't. There simply is no evidence. I would like to respond to something about Colonel Halt talking about the idea that the Air Force never contacted him or investigated this incident. Since the closing of Blue Book in 1969, it has been official United States Air Force policy not to take a UFO report, pro, con, negative, or any otherwise. It actually is... Well, because it caused a great deal of bad publicity for the United States Air Force, and they didn't want to be involved with it. So the official policy is if someone calls up the Air Force about a UFO, they simply say, they refer the people to local law enforcement agencies without comment.
There's another area I want to cover, and we've got John Callahan been standing by, but you want to say something quickly?
I'd like to say one thing. Are you aware that the OSI did investigate this?
I am aware that the OSI investigated it. Of course, the OSI, of course, looks into anything very often that security police do, and I don't want to get into why that is.
What do you think? What do you think, Jim, of the story of that Japan Air cargo that saw the twin cylinders flying in formation?
Well, it's you have to look at what happened that night. He reported seeing initially a light following him. It's interesting that the direction he was looking was directly at Jupiter, which happened to be at its brightest that night. But all the radar targets that were reported that night, the FAA itself in its report says was transponder clutter and scatter, and the Air Force as well. But what's interesting is two airplanes that night, a United Airlines aircraft and a C-130 that were in the area, were asked to be vectored slightly off their courses so they could view the aircraft that night, and both of them flew near the aircraft that night and didn't see any target, any aircraft around the 747.
Let John Callahan respond. John?
Well, if you looked at the videotape that we took, you could see that there's a target. Every time the Japanese pilot said there was target at 12 o'clock or 2 o'clock, that we had a primary hit there. Our own...
Well, the FAA doesn't agree with that, sir.
Well, that's... you know, the FAA doesn't want to control UFOs. Just because they say it's not there, you got to remember now, if you were flying today and you looked out the window as a pilot and you said, hey, who's at my altitude, the first thing the controller would think of is I got two together, and then he would say, can you tell me what kind of airplane it is? And you would say, yes, it looks like an F-105. And they would say, if you got some numbers you can give me off it, and we'll track that guy down and we'll fix him for good for being up there. And you would say, yeah, here's his tail number. Now, we can't do that with a UFO. When the pilot looked out there and he says, I have traffic out here, apparently the three Japanese pilots are also lying. It's funny that everybody that's involved...
I got to get a break, guys, but you're making a good point. We'll come back with our remaining moments. Just skim the surface. Don't go away.
They saw the planet, I think Saturn, was it Saturn? Jupiter, and that the CIA considers Jupiter classified. And that I guess the FAA official was told never to talk about the planet Jupiter. So that's interesting.
Let's get a call. Los Angeles. Hello.
Hello. Good evening, Larry. How you guys doing tonight?
Fine. Quickly, go ahead.
What was the most recent sighting in the United States, and where was it, and who saw it?
Do we know, Fife?
O'Hare.
It was O'Hare, United Airlines O'Hare, right over the airport. Yeah. There's a lot of press about it.
Yeah.
United Airlines pilots, crew, maintenance people on the ground.
I actually talked to a couple of the United Airlines personnel, and privately they admitted what they saw was a disc-shaped object, broad daylight, punched a hole through the clouds when it left, but they would not go on the record because they were debriefed by United Airlines, and the United Airlines said they would lose their job.
I remember it was headlines in the national news when it occurred.
James, they would have no point in lying, would they?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, why would the military officers, why would they lie?
Oh, I don't question that military officers are lying. I just doubt whether they're accurately seeing and reporting what they're seeing. And there are many. It's very easy to be fooled.
Yeah. All right, we've run out of time, but I thank you all.
An hour in this area.
But I do remember speeds in excess of 4,000 to 5,000 miles an hour.
And he said it was traveling 10,000 miles plus.
And they were going somewhere in the neighborhood of 11 to 14,000 miles an hour.
They covered the distance from Columbus to Detroit in something like equivalent of about 20,000 miles an hour.
It's not an infrequent occurrence out there. They happen quite often.
There were probably 1,500 reported cases at that time.
I have over 3,000 cases now.
They estimated 100 yards from the left wing was this 100-foot disc.
And the strength of the signal was as strong as the surface contact on the water of an aircraft carrier. This contact was huge.
The size of these objects around 100 meters or greater.
So it would go from 1 o'clock, 7 or 8 miles to 6, 7 o'clock, 7 or 8 miles inside of 4 or 5 seconds, you have to be moving pretty quickly.
They could rise, just go straight up. They could do that, just seemed like instantaneous.
Once they started moving, they went straight up, for a while, and then they went zap.
Then it just sort of disappeared. It dematerialized.
And left the atmosphere, just was gone. It just took off into space.
It just left at high speed.
He said, "You are never to speak of this again. As far as you're concerned, this never happened."
And you never saw this, and I don't exist, and this situation never happened.
I didn't want to look at it any longer than that because I felt that my life was in jeopardy.
So I was beaten, literally hit in the ribs and pushed, and I was resisting. And I know Sergeant Bustinza was doing the same thing.
Measures have been taken by agencies to terminate people who appear to be inconvenient or troublesome through knowing too much.
Whatever activity is going on, to the extent that it is a clandestine group, a quasi-government group, a quasi-private group, it is without any type, as far as I can tell, of high-level government oversight. And that is a great concern.
A shadowy government with its own Air Force, its own Navy, its own fundraising mechanism, and the ability to pursue its own ideas of the national interest, free from all checks and balances, and free from the law itself.
We have contact with aliens not originating from some foreign country, but from some other solar system. And I have been a party to that.
My name is Dr. Stephen Greer. I am the director of the Disclosure Project, which is a project of the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence. This is a project which we have been working on since 1992. And during this time, we have identified over 400 military, intelligence, and corporate witnesses to special access projects within the United States and elsewhere that deal with what the public has called UFOs, extraterrestrial intelligence, and advanced energy and propulsion systems. The purpose of this executive briefing is to put together some of this witness testimony. I want to emphasize that out of the over 400 witnesses whom we have identified, that we have interviewed to date on camera approximately 100. Of those, 120 hours of videotape have been created of testimony from these witnesses. This executive summary can only contain a very small tip of the iceberg, less than 1/2% of the possible testimony which we have. But it will give you an idea of the extent of the knowledge of these men and women who have come forward heroically to tell the world, to tell our elected representatives and our scientists the truth about a subject which has been the subject of much ridicule, fantasy, and speculation for over 50 years. We will present 3 essential areas. Number 1, what is the evidence? What is the testimony support? What is the case file support? And what do the government documents support? We will also then move on to something a little more difficult to explain, and that is the mechanism for secrecy. How has something of this import been kept secret from our representatives, and how has it been kept off the national and international radar screen effectively for over 50 years? Without understanding this, the evidence itself has no foundation, because any rational person will conclude that this couldn't be true, or we would know about it, that the government leaks secrets like a sieve, and that indeed, if any of this were true, many of the people in society, in high places in our government, would know about it, when in fact they do not. So the secrecy around this issue, which has been extraordinary, must also be explained, and it will be. And the third component is the why. Why has it been kept secret? What are the implications? I will remind you that a very conservative Republican 2-term president and 5-star general, Dwight Eisenhower, said that we should be careful of the excesses of the military-industrial complex.